am I?
In the village.
What do you want?
Information.
Whose side are you on?
That would be telling. We want information. Information.
You won't get it.
By hook or by crook, we will.
Who are you?
The new number 2.
Who is number 1?
You are number 6.
I am not a number. I am a free man.
Good morning. On behalf of the Eliezer Wheelock Society, the Dartmouth Apologia, and the Association of Christian Tuck Students, welcome to the 9th annual Wheelock Conference, What's Your Why? My name is Sarah Holston, Dartmouth class of 2017 and student director of the Eliezer Wheelock Society. I am thrilled to see all of you here with us this morning. If you're confused about what you just watched, don't worry, it is all about to be very clear. Several months ago, we settled on the theme for this year's conference while sitting around a brunch table and discussing conferences past, conferences present, and conferences future. We found ourselves on the topic of this British television show from 1967 to 68 called The Prisoner. What you saw was the introduction for every episode. The premise: a British secret agent decides, seemingly out of the blue, to resign, and he's subsequently abducted. He wakes up in the village, where he is referred to as number 6, and constantly subjected to schemes designed to uncover why he resigned. If you're still not sure where this was going, neither was I. So as a pitch for the conference theme, we watched another clip, this time of one of the many attempts to persuade, trick, or force the prisoner to reveal his motivations. And we're gonna roll that clip right now.
Point 3. Access to these is through where? Through where?
Administration, sir.
Exactly. Put that down. Also that number 12 is an official in administration. Now, ask the general.
A question that can't be answered.
What's that?
There is a question that the general cannot answer.
Impossible.
Allow me to ask it.
No.
Are you afraid?
Go ahead.
Excuse me, Professor. Thank you. With your permission. Feed it in.
was the question?
It's insoluble for man or machine.
What was it?
W-H-Y. Question mark.
Why?
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 So, as you know, the question we're examining in this year's conference is the same question the prisoner poses to the all-knowing supercomputer known as the General. Why? It's a question that is all around us, though we seldom look to see it. The third most watched TED Talk is given by author and motivational speaker Simon Sinek, who has built a company called Start With Why. Another Dartmouth conference happening right now in Chicago offers to help attendees clarify their values and their why. And yet, though people everywhere are asking, no satisfying answers are at hand. It can be hard not to feel like the prisoner in this scene, insisting that the question is insoluble to man or machine. Because why is hard? There are 5 W's in analysis and problem solving: who, what, when, where, and why. The other 4 questions often have simple, possibly one-word answers. Who? Mr. Clark. Where? In the library. What? The candlestick. When? During breakfast. And then we reach the why, and suddenly everything is a lot less clear. But when we fail to find an answer we seek, there are 2 possible causes. Maybe the answer doesn't exist. Maybe we're just looking in the wrong places. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of Auschwitz and author of the book Man's Search for Meaning, writes, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. Suddenly, we find that we are not the prisoner in this scene. We are not the ones asking the question to an entity that we've been told can provide all the answers. We are the general. We are the ones responsible for finding the answers to the whys. And as in the case of the general, when we confront this question, life starts to break down. The world today does not do a good job of equipping us to think well about this question. From classes in university on how to achieve the good life, to self-help books, most of the resources available allow us to passively rely on someone or something else to explain why our lives are meaningful and to help point us down the right path. We're told to seek diligently and to pursue tirelessly, but taught that our job stops there. If we look hard enough, or if we find just the right book of advice, we'll find the answer hiding in plain sight. When we don't, the world shrugs and tells us that maybe the question was insoluble after all. And so, like the general, when we are asked why, we start to overload, applying our metrics for answering questions and finding that they aren't quite adequate for this one. Who here has ever played the why game with a small child, where you say something and the child asks why? And you say, well, because blah, blah, blah. And the child goes, why? And you say, well, because blah, blah, blah. And the child just looks at you and goes, but why? As the whys keep coming, we keep going along the spiral of increasing frustration, and our explanations get more vague and less confident. Eventually, we're stumped. And at that point, the only answer we have left is something like, because it just is, okay? While it might be easier to leave it at that, life has a way of pushing us beyond that answer. No child will respond to, it just is, with anything but yet another why. We aren't satisfied with it just is any more than we are satisfied by the thought that the question might be insoluble, because instinctually, we know that this is the most important question we will ever be asked. Everything else is a means question. What do you need to do, and how do you need to do it to get where you want to go? But why is the ends question. Where do you want to be? If we don't look in the right place for the answers, eventually we'll stop asking. And then life becomes just a dance of the dead. At EWS, we often say that you get what you really want in life and you become what you really intend. If this is true, then our first and most important task ought to be deciding what that is. Avoiding the question only means that we may become something we don't like at the end of the day. So, where do we start? That is the question that we're here today to figure out. We may not currently have the programming to think well about why, but together we can start to develop a better toolkit to apply to the question. In a few moments, I'll introduce our first speaker to get the ball rolling. As you move through the sessions set out for the day, I challenge you to engage fully with the people around you. Though the responsibility for finding your answer is on you, that doesn't mean you're going to figure it out by thinking in a vacuum. Don't just listen to the stories of the speakers today, engage them in a dialogue. Share your thoughts and ideas with the others in the room, experiment with the possibilities, and see what sticks. To the students here this morning, though you may see the seats around you filled with talented, accomplished, and maybe intimidating grown-ups, everyone here was once your age, facing many of the questions and the decisions that you're tackling right now, and they've come back to offer wisdom they've gained along the way. Don't shy away from striking up conversations and trying to learn from a new perspective. To the alumni who've joined us, the journey of discovery and the pursuit of an answer to the whys in life never quite ends. And fairly often, we find that life after the university offers even less by way of resources and environment to explore the question. We hope that today helps you recapture what it means to be a student of life, seeking alongside fellow learners. To our faculty and staff, you've already devoted so much to guiding and contributing to the educational experiences of others. And without your work, very few of us would be in this room today, pursuing truth with the confidence to know that we can reach for it, and the enthusiasm to be sure that it is worth every challenge along the way. We are grateful and excited to step outside the classroom with you and to link arms as we think critically and question honestly. Before we jump into the main event, I want to thank everyone who's given of themselves to make this conference a success. To our many speakers, to the staff of the Dartmouth Apologia, to the Tuck School for hosting us here today, the Eliezer Wheelock Society and its board, to all the students who woke up early this morning to come in and get everything prepared, to Sandy Rosilla and Allison Pearson, without whom this would never have come together, and to the many others who have worked so hard to make this conference possible. Thank you for all of the time, the funds, and the effort you have so generously contributed to this event. Without further ado, I will introduce our keynote speaker. Charlie Clark is a Dartmouth 11 and an editor-in-chief emeritus of the Apologia. When choosing a keynoter for the theme, What's Your Why?, we quickly realized that nobody thinks about this question as deeply as Charlie. When Andrew Schumann, founder and first editor-in-chief of the Apologia, knocked on Charlie's door one night as part of a recruiting campaign, Charlie proceeded to interview Andrew about the vision for the journal before deciding to take up the cause. And take it up he did. After helping to grow the young Apologia into a force to be reckoned with, Charlie graduated and went on to get his law degree. Deciding not to pursue a career as a lawyer, he took up leadership of the family business, a scrap metal recycling yard in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. But that's just his day job. Charlie was also the founding chairman of Fair Forward, an Apologia-like journal of Christian thought for the post-undergraduate world. He mentored the start of an undergraduate journal at Vanderbilt and has recently taken up the vice chairmanship of EWS. Even at his day job, Charlie can be found Instagramming photos of unusual pieces of scrap metal with captions reflecting on their philosophical commentary on modern culture. To those who know him well, Charlie stands alongside the great Christian intellectuals we read and discuss in Apologia meetings, and we are truly honored to hear from him this morning. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Clark.
Thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I was at the first Wheelock conference 8 years ago, and so I do know what a tremendous honor it is to be speaking to you all today. And in the spirit of imposter syndrome, I'd like to begin with a self-deprecating apology. But I'll restrain myself and just go on to what I was here to say. I've already been accused of trying to hype things down. but I don't know what that means, and so I can't defend myself. What I'm going to attempt this morning is to lay a foundation for our day of conversations with one another, to introduce a framework for talking about questions of purpose and sources of meaning. Very few of us get out of our freshman year of college feeling like we know exactly what we're here for. Most of us enter adulthood with more questions than answers when it comes to how to live meaningfully. We are all existentialists now. Because what we don't want is to wake up 10 years from now and ask, why am I working this job? Why am I living in this place? What's the point? And not have a good answer. We don't want to find ourselves trapped in a flat, characterless, suburban sprawl of a life. That's how you get Fight Club. We don't want to be faced with the question why and come up empty-handed. So one reason I call this talk In Search of Character is because character is a good word for what we're looking for. We want a life that has texture, consequence, flavor. Character is the difference between a mansion and a McMansion. A beautiful old house with the arched doorways and the crown molding and the stained glass has character. And that's the life we want to live in, so to speak. We want a life that's like the leather-bound inscribed first edition from Special Collections, not like the airport paperback I bought on the way here. And there's a reason we're all worried that we might not get a life with character. It's actually incredibly easy to drift, to become what Walker Percy called sunk in everydayness. When you're sunk in everydayness, you're really only half living. The part of the human being that eats and drinks and sleeps is carrying on, but the part that questions the universe, that tries to learn its place in it, is turned off. And our society offers us a strong alternative to the question why, namely, endless ways to keep us from ever having to think about it. That's how you get Netflix. That's also how you get the 60, 70, or 80-hour work week. If we can keep you busy enough, you won't have time or attention to reflect on what really matters. If we can keep you distracted, you won't ever look around and ask, why does any of this matter? But none of you are distracted this morning. Against your better judgment, you decided to come and give me your undivided attention. And you've settled in to stare with me, shoulder to shoulder, into the abyss for a group existential crisis. So, my education at Dartmouth and before only gave me bits and pieces of what I needed to ask about meaning. It basically gave me this really disorganized toolbox of what are called values. Now, values, for those of you who haven't heard of these, are these abstract ideas about what you're supposed to want or supposed to accomplish. So, for example, one value that you may have heard of is making the world a better place. Another one is not wasting your talents. Another one is to make a decent living. And then there's like friendship and romance and all that love stuff that you've heard, is out there. And I think the idea was that if I took this toolbox and I pursued these values, and I chose the right values, then I'd have a happy, meaningful life. So here's the problem. Values are only so helpful because they're hard to apply. When you approach a practical question, it's really hard to say in advance, how much would taking this job really make the world a better place? And it's also really hard to compare across different opportunities and different values. So maybe I decide that job really would make the world a better place, but I feel like I would use my talents more fully in grad school. And if I really wanted cool friends, I should just ditch all of that and follow Rainbow Kitten Surprise on tour. So values involve you in a very complicated calculus where you're checking off different boxes and assigning weights and trying to figure out what the best return might be. And when you have a lot of options, like Dartmouth grads tend to have, that can be very paralyzing. It's a terrible system if you're at all indecisive. And I know nobody here has ever been accused of being indecisive. So values are better than nothing. I'm not here to propose a revaluation of all values. That's how you get, well, whatever you and your tribe blame Nietzsche for. Probably unfairly. I'm also not here to defend Nietzsche. That's a different lecture entirely. But I am going to try and get us out of this endless calculus problem into a more user-friendly framework for pursuing meaning. It's a framework that better reflects the human condition, the way we actually experience our lives. Everything I'm about to describe for the next few minutes, I basically owe to one or two sources. First is a person I've already mentioned, the Southern Catholic novelist Walker Percy. And the other is the Northern Catholic philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. I guess he's Northern. He teaches at Notre Dame. I'm especially indebted to chapter 15 of MacIntyre's book, After Virtue. But let me begin with Percy and his collection of essays entitled The Message in the Bottle. Percy proposes a thought experiment, and I'm going to paraphrase it. He says, imagine a Martian making his first visit to Earth. This Martian is intelligent, even highly intelligent, and he communicates with his fellow Martians through direct mind-to-mind contact. He has a kind of ESP where thoughts and feelings pass seamlessly from one consciousness to another. Now, this Martian encounters our world for the first time, and he observes his first humans. What does he notice? And this is what Percy says. They are forever making mouthy little sounds. Clicks, hisses, howls, hoots, explosions, squeaks. And some of these sounds name things in the world and are uttered in short sequences that say something about these things and events in the world. For the Martian that uses ESP and has no need for language, this would be very strange. Far stranger than it is for us. We have a remarkably difficult time seeing language for what it really is, because it is, as Percy says, the very mirror by which we see and know the world. But for the Martian who is observing humans for the first time, our use of language, there's no doubt that that would be the most significant fact about our species. So this is where MacIntyre comes in. The human being's immersion in language, and especially in the practice of conversation. Not only are we constantly exchanging symbols, we even exchange these things we call reasons. We are capable of describing and explaining ourselves and having those descriptions and explanations heard and understood. Because we are capable of describing our actions and intentions in words, our expectation for other human beings is that they will always be able to provide an explanation for whatever it is they're doing. What is possible becomes expected. As conversational, rational beings, we hold other conversational, rational beings accountable for their actions, which is to say, we expect them to be able to provide a coherent account of what it is they're doing and why. This is not something we expect from rocks or trees, or especially cats. Here's how MacIntyre illustrates this point. Whenever we cannot identify the meaning of an action, we are intellectually and practically baffled. We don't know what that action means. We don't know what to think about it or how to respond to it. And here's his example. He says, imagine I am standing waiting for a bus, and the young man next to me suddenly says, the name of the common wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. Now, I don't have a problem understanding the sentence that's been uttered. It's perfectly grammatical. It has a meaning according to the rules of language, and it happens to be true. But I don't have the first clue why he has bestowed this information upon me. His action is unintelligible to me. And my task as a fellow rational being is to now make that action intelligible. So I ask myself, okay, maybe he thinks I'm the guy who asked him yesterday, do you by chance know the Latin name for the common wild duck? It's a case of mistaken identity. Or, if you're more paranoid like I am, you say, okay, he's a spy. And this was his ill-chosen code sentence that's supposed to identify his contact, and he thinks that I'm the spy on the other side. But the point is we're going to try and come up with an explanation for why he has said this all out of the blue. If no explanation can be given to render his action intelligible, then I have to conclude that he's suffering from some form of madness. So, consider this. Not only do we hold other people accountable for their actions, we hold ourselves accountable too. We demand that our own actions be intelligible to us. People in the grip of despair complain that there is no compelling reason to do one thing versus another, or to do anything at all. They characteristically describe their lives as what? Meaningless. They have no why because their actions and circumstances have become unintelligible to them, and they no longer know how to respond to themselves. So here's what we have so far. Human beings are meaning seekers because of our immersion in language. Our ability to engage in conversation and to give accounts for our behavior leads to a universal demand that our actions be intelligible. And for our actions to be unintelligible is a sign of madness or a symptom of despair. So, if we were to avoid those bad ends, the question becomes, what is the source of intelligibility? What are the characteristics of intelligible action? Under what circumstances will our actions and lives, which they constitute, prove to be meaningful? Let's break it down by imagining some small actions. Suppose I take out 3 eggs and crack them into a bowl and add flour and sugar and butter. First off, if I did that right now, right here, it would seem very strange. I'd be like the duck guy at the bus stop. That's because one of the things that an action requires to be intelligible is an appropriate setting. Put another way, we need context to determine the meaning of an action or for the action to have any meaning at all. So go back to the Latin name of the common wild duck. If the speaker in that example wasn't a rando at a bus stop, but was your professor in biology and he was lecturing on avian taxonomy, everything makes sense now, right? So setting, as a kind of context, is very important for understanding the meaning of a person's actions, and it's going to be very important for understanding the meaning of your own actions. Returning to this other example, so now you're picturing me at home in my kitchen, and I take out 3 eggs and I crack them into a bowl, and I add flour and sugar and butter. And even though I'm in my kitchen, and it should be pretty obvious, you come in and you go, "What are you doing?" And I say, "I'm cracking eggs into a bowl, and I'm adding flour and sugar and butter." Okay? You wouldn't be very satisfied with that answer. You'd probably think I was a bit of a smart aleck, and you'd definitely be right, but this is important. If I only describe my outward actions, I have not adequately described what I am doing according to the general rules of human accountability. I have not yet given you my reason. So we see right away that the question, what are you doing, comes with an embedded question, not only what are you doing, but why are you doing it? In other words, I must attribute my action to some intention, some purpose for which I am acting. Now, I could describe my intention of doing this whole egg cracking, flour adding thing on a number of different levels. I could say, I am baking. I could say, I am making a cake. I could say, I'm preparing for a birthday party. I could say, I am doing something kind for my mother. So a picture begins to emerge. To render an action intelligible, we require 2 different kinds of context. First, we have to refer to a person's intention, and second, we have to refer them to the setting in which the actions occur. Now, English majors in the room, Hopefully, this is starting to sound a little bit familiar. If they haven't, if it's not, you've been failed. Go take another course, maybe you'll get there. When you take action and setting and intention and you put those together, what do you get? So as McIntyre points out, these three ingredients are essentially what is required for a narrative. And here's the quote. Narrative history of a certain kind turns out to be the basic and essential genre for the characterization of human actions. That is, actions are intelligible, meaningful, able to be accounted for, unlikely to throw you into despair or make you look insane, to the degree that they can be placed within a coherent narrative. And conversely, intelligible actions are enacted narratives. What I'm saying is, the way to understand our lives is to see ourselves as characters in a story. So let's apply this to a more down-to-earth, familiar example. A student is sitting at a desk in the stacks, surrounded by books, typing away on a laptop. We take in her setting, and we could say she is typing, writing a sentence, working on a research paper, or trying to finish her thesis before the deadline. We get a clearer picture of her intention with each answer as it contextualizes her action into a variety of different stories. But the most basic answer, that she's typing a sentence, is still an episode in the story of how she came to college, took a class in the history department, and fell in love with Second Empire France. It's the Napoleon III. He's very dreamy, I'm told. In typing that sentence, she is enacting the narrative of how she would graduate cum laude and go on to graduate school and become a professor herself. If it weren't for the story of which typing each and every sentence of her thesis is a part, she wouldn't be performing the action at all. And as long as she remembers the whole story, she has a why for each individual episode. Furthermore, our senior is actually embedded in a series of narratives, all of which are made up of the individual acts she and the people around her are performing. Every action brings some story to life, and the actions of others enter our story and her story as well. As McIntyre puts it, we are never more than co-authors of our stories. We enter upon a stage which we did not design, and we find ourselves part of an action that was not of our making. So, writing her thesis one sentence at a time is not only part of her story, it's part of her family's story, it's part of her classmates' story, and it's part of the college's story. So, we understand our narratives by entering into the roles into which we've been drafted. It is finding our place on that communal stage that gives us a narrative to take up. If you only remember one quote from everything I'm saying today, let it be this one. This is McIntyre again. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. So, here's our takeaways so far. 1, the way to find meaning in your actions and your choices is to situate them in a narrative. You have to be able to identify a story in which your action is a plausible episode. Otherwise, your action will appear unintelligible to you. And because you are a rational, accountable human being, that will be distressing. 2, when you go to make what do I do next decisions, think about your life like an author would about a work in progress. The story up to now being what it is, what would be the most fitting next chapter? What would make for the best, most interesting, most beautiful story? 3, you are never more than a co-author of your life. You are a character in a play already in progress. This is Act 2 or 3, and you only have partial creative control. Learn to love the limits that imposes. And don't forget that the key question is, into what stories have I been drafted? So let me give you, having established all of that background, let me give you an example that hopefully ties a lot of these theoretical threads together. My family's business, Clark Iron and Metal Company, was founded by my great-grandfather. He got his start during the Depression with what he called his farmer's produce company. I'm from Middle Tennessee, and that's where the business is. And Middle Tennessee was much more rural back then. The town I'm from, Murfreesboro, was about a tenth the size it is now. And the whole countryside was small farms, and the farmers would bring their produce into town and sell it on the square. But the commercial dairy business was just getting started, and that wasn't a very efficient way to supply it. So Charles, he was called Charles, we're all called Charles, became the reverse milkman. He would drive from farm to farm and buy milk or cream, a few gallons here and a few gallons there, and then he'd sell a truckload at a time to the dairies. But while he was out on the farms, he also would buy eggs and herbs and wool, and eventually he figured out you could make money off of just about anything. So he started buying waste. He bought paper, rags, hides, and scrap metal, which is how we came to be Clark Iron and Metal Company. And that's how we ended up in the recycling business. So by the 60s, the business was Clark Iron and Metal, not the Farmers Produce Company, and scrap metal was our primary stock in trade. We kept buying paper and a few other recyclables, but we stopped buying food, except for one thing: walnuts. There are black walnut trees all over Middle Tennessee, and they produce a lot of really tough nuts every fall. And most people basically view them as a nuisance. The outer hull is this tough, green, leathery thing, and it will stain your hands and your clothes. And then the inner shell is basically impossible to crack. This is jumping ahead in the story a little bit, but I had this big leathery thing, like lever, that you pull on and it basically explodes, and you kind of have to have like goggles on. It's pretty rough. But they're delicious. And they designed machines that could hull and shell them a whole lot faster than you can do it by hand. So this was a great thing for us to buy. Economies of scale and, people, economics, price system, whatever. And people who would otherwise pick up all of these nuts and throw them away because they were too much work could bring them to us, sell them, make a few bucks, and treat themselves to a black walnut ice cream or something else down the line. So we kept buying walnuts for a long time, but in the 80s the price fell, and we finally quit that too. And by the time I started working at the yard during summers in high school, we only bought metal. But we'd still get calls every year from some old timer or some old timer's grandkid who remembered that Clark's bought walnuts and had gathered up a bunch and wanted to know what the price was. Now, if they were calling about glass or paper or any of those other things we used to recycle but didn't anymore, we could always refer them to somewhere else. There's somebody that takes glass or paper. But for walnuts, it was just like, yeah, sorry, nobody does that anymore. So I got out of law school and went back to work there. And we were still getting calls about black walnuts. Hadn't bought them in 20, 30 years, but still this legend was out there. And the whole situation didn't really sit well with me. I mean, if our business stood for anything, it was that let nothing useful go to waste. So hopefully you're starting to see where this is going. I'd found myself in a narrative situation, right? I've come into this story, very deep into the fourth act, and I found myself as a character within it with the power to shape how the next chapter would go. So back in 2015, I started experimenting with black walnuts. I learned to hull them and dry them and crack them, and I made my first batch of black walnut cocktail bitters. And I bottled it, and I put a little label on it that said Farmers Produce Company. And in 2016 and 2017, Clark Iron and Metal bought black walnuts again. And we didn't buy very many, but for anybody who called, we could tell them they had something of value and they shouldn't throw it away. And when we buy black walnuts again this fall, and I hull them and shell them and come away with green hands, that will be a small way of enacting the narrative of being true to the story of the Clark family in the city of Murfreesboro that doesn't let good things go to waste. And every day, when I go to work at the scrapyard and I make my calls and mess around with my spreadsheets, I'm enacting that narrative too. And what could be generally soul-sucking is actually pretty meaningful because it's more than just my day-to-day. It's one thread in a story that has been playing out for 100 years and that touches thousands of other threads in my provincial hometown. So the story I've just examined, I've just pulled this narrative element out of, is a personal one. But I also want to talk to you today about a story that we're all part of together. By virtue of your being here today, I know that you've been drafted into the story of Dartmouth College. Your story is embedded in the story of this institution. So let's talk about Eliezer Wheelock. I wear this ring every day, not because it tells people I went to Dartmouth. The scrapyard is not the place to rest on your Ivy League laurels. The people I work with truly do not care where I went to school. If anything, they're a little suspicious of the whole process. But I wear it because it reminds me of part of my purpose and part of the meaning of my life. It says on it, Vox Clamantis in Deserto. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. It's a quotation from the book of Isaiah. It's a prophet's voice. And it captures what Eliezer Wheelock believed about Dartmouth. Towards the end of his life, he wrote this, and it is my purpose that this school of the prophets may be and long continue to be a pure fountain. And I do with my whole heart will this purpose to all my successors. When he founded Dartmouth College, Wheelock bequeathed a legacy to all who would come after him. And in case you don't know, it's a bit of a complicated legacy, and we're going to get into that. But here's what you need to know about the man himself. He was a real fire and brimstone type, like a real honest Puritan. And he preached at revivals during the First Great Awakening. Fun fact, the night that Jonathan Edwards gave his famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon, which if you've taken that period of American history, you've certainly read, Wheelock was in the audience. Thought that was cool. And to all appearances, he believed every single word of that sermon. So in his letters and in his personal writings, nothing looms larger than the fate of souls. Very pious indeed. He was also a true believer in the life of the mind, a genuine scholar. He won the award for academic distinction in classics when he was at Yale. We won't hold Yale against him. I'm sure Dartmouth was his first choice, but nobody had founded it yet. And later, he turned his house into a school, and students lived there with him, and he taught what we would still recognize as liberal arts. He was actually on the cutting edge of 18th century education. He taught empiricism straight out of Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Wheelock was also a man of the world. He was a farmer, a very successful farmer. He was a businessman, and he was a politician. And he believed that students had to master practical skills and disciplines as well. He believed that people's lives would be improved by the spread of technology and medicine and good business practices. And this humanitarian practical dimension was just as important for the graduates of his college to excel in. What Wheelock believed about that voice crying in the wilderness was that through the work of his school, by educating students rich and poor, native and English, teaching them to integrate faith, reason, and vocation, that he was fulfilling a divine mission. That in educating the whole person, regardless of their background, and sending them out to apply that learning and share it with the world, his school was part of a divine plan that every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill made low. That was his prophetic vision. Now, Wheelock's vision was flawed and incomplete, and the institution he founded throughout its history has had to wrestle with those flaws. His mission to Native Americans was tainted by cultural imperialism and a failure to acknowledge that colonials like himself were responsible for many of the problems he was seeking to relieve. But in words which were often better than his deeds, he laid a foundation for an inclusive institution, even if it took 200 years for that part of the college's narrative to begin to be enacted, and even if it is yet to be enacted as it ought to be. So this is the deposit that every generation of Dartmouth students and faculty and alumni have inherited. We have an educational mission, a vision of human flourishing, and of Dartmouth producing the emissaries of this vision and equipping them to carry it into the world beyond. But where Wheelock failed to practice what he preached, we have the opportunity as his successors to be more faithful to the college's story than those who came before. And the challenge to each generation has been to make this narrative more true to the world as it is, and the enactment more true to itself. And I believe that's the challenge for the Eliezer Wheelock Society. So, thinking practically about how we enact this narrative, how we participate and find meaning within it, what are some marks of a person formed by this prophetic vision for Dartmouth College? I don't mean this to be a comprehensive sketch, but I want to highlight a few things that I see that could be distinctive of the integration of faith, reason, and vocation at Dartmouth. Let's start with faith. At Dartmouth, beginning with Apologia, we've had a strong history of Christians from different traditions working together in a spirit of unity and mutual respect. We've shown that Catholics and Protestants, Christians from across cultures, worship styles, and theological opinions can all be enriched by seeing what they have in common and by sharing their particular strengths from each of their backgrounds. As Dartmouth sends its prophets out into the world, I would hope that they would continue to model cooperation and fellowship among all believers. Second, by always being careful in our words and presentations to those outside the Christian community, we have shown that the Christian faith deserves its place in public discourse. We need never, therefore, be fearful or to feel embattled by the larger society. Instead, our people should have a quiet confidence that where the truth is spoken with gentleness and charity, it will not return void. Dartmouth is uniquely suited to prepare Christians who are secure in their faith in any environment. Turning to reason. Because we've recognized the difficulty in getting a hearing for Christian perspectives in the academic community, we've always held ourselves to a high standard of intellectual rigor. This standard should apply beyond the pages of Apologia and beyond the bounds of this conference. It should extend to all we think and say. Our efforts should remind and encourage the college in its duty to foster an intellectual culture, and our graduates should leaven the fad-driven, prejudiced, and unrigorous environment outside its walls. I continue to believe that there is no better tool for training the habit of rigor than the liberal arts. So many of our intellectual maladies as a society can be traced to hyperspecialization and the failure to develop a broad general knowledge. Prophets cannot be mere technicians. We must seek broad horizons, even against pressure to narrow our perspective. Finally, with respect to vocation, the spirit of our founding demands that we serve people. We cannot be content merely to perpetuate systems. We must honor and defend the value and dignity of every individual. We must do so not from a stance of condescension, but one of solidarity, of awareness and availability to those we serve. And second, we must serve the work. Whatever we do, we must treat our craft, our profession, as if it were an end, not merely an instrument. Recall, every action is meaningful only insofar as it is part of a story. And every craft and occupation and profession has a story. Learn that story and honor all those who came before you and all who will come after you by pursuing the particular excellence of your work. Whenever I read that Vox Clamantis in Deserto on my ring, it reminds me that I went to Eliezer Wheelock's School for Prophets. And that's the kind of prophet that I want to be, and that I believe that Dartmouth Canon should produce. That, for me, the integration of faith, reason, and vocation, is the true narrative of this institution. And I invite all of you to join me in enacting that narrative. Like me, each of you has stories that you're a part of that I'm not. You have your own individual narratives to enact and other roles that you've been drafted into and assigned. And our challenge today, in conversation with one another, is to discover what those stories are and to explore how they're embedded in one another and to encourage one another as we seek to write the next chapter. Thank you. That was planned.
Thank you, Charlie. So we have 2 rounds of interviews coming up now. The first one starts at 10:15, so we've got just under 15 minutes. There's 2 options to choose from in that. The 2 classrooms for that are the 2 classrooms we're going to be using for both of our next couple sessions. Borelli, if you go out here, is sort of just around the corner to your right, and Franz is across the way. There's some beverages and snacks outside the classroom in the hallway if you'd like to grab something on your way to the next session. The second sessions are going to start pretty shortly after the first one ends. There's only about a 5-minute period between the 2. So again, you can sort of grab something on the go between those if you're switching classrooms or if you want to pop out and get something. But if you could, as much as possible, try to move briskly between those 2 classrooms. And we've got a little bit of a longer break now before the first session starts. So after those 2 interview sessions, we break for lunch. That'll be back up in the atrium, which is where you came in and where breakfast was served early. And then the afternoon sessions start with a musical performance by Zato, which is Dartmouth's Christian a cappella group. They've been coming for a number of years now, and that's always a really great moment in the conference. We'll be back in here for that session, and that'll be immediately followed by our last interview. There's only one during that time of the day, so we'll all come back together in this classroom for one final session before the afternoon mixer. That's up in the atrium as well again, and it'll be a really great opportunity to reconvene at the end of the day for a while over snacks and some drinks and just getting to chat and discuss the things that you've learned, the stories that you've heard, and what you're hoping to walk away with. So we are going to run on time today, so please stay on schedule. I will be watching you as we move between classrooms. And if you need anything or if you sort of get lost, some of the classrooms, while they're all relatively on top of each other, are kind of like definitely hiding behind nooks and crannies. So flag me or Allison, or there are a number of students around. Flag somebody who looks like a student and they'll probably be able to help you. We've got a lot packed into the next few hours, so I hope you're getting really excited and get to your first round of panels.